Good evening, everybody. Thank you for coming. I'm going to make my pitch as to why George Boutwell, in my estimation, is the most consequential American public figure of the 1900s that you've never heard of, at least prior to the advertising for this program. But first, I want to say it's a special treat to be here at the Crane Library in Quincy for three reasons. One has to do with John Quincy Adams. George Boutwell was a great admirer of John Quincy Adams in the 1830s and 1840s. Their anti-slavery positions, their the right to petition and fighting the gag rule in Congress, which I'll get into in a little bit. But George was a great admirer of John Quincy Adams and even was part of the formal funeral ceremony in 1848 when Adams's body was brought from Washington to Boston, Boston down here to Braintree, I guess it was at the time, or Quincy, and then buried. So real strong connection between George and John Quincy Adams. Secondly, in 1865, George gave an Independence Day talk in Weymouth, Massachusetts, the next town over, 4th of July speech. And remember, this was just a few months after Lincoln had been assassinated. The country was in turmoil. And George essentially used that speech to warn the country about what he saw as the danger posed by President Andrew Johnson against Reconstruction and the protection of black rights in the South. So there's a nice connection to Weymouth. Third special reason for being here is that a very special friend for 25 years, Mavis Anderson, who I first met in Washington, D.C., even before the year 2000, has been living here in Quincy for several years. So it's nice to be giving a talk in Mavis's backyard. And with that, we'll get into George Boutwell and why I think he is a very consequential public figure. There are two reasons I give. One, his longevity in public life. 65 years George was involved in American public affairs from 1839 to 1904 and 1905. He met his first president, Martin Van Buren, in 1839, came face to face with his final president, Teddy Roosevelt, in 1904. More importantly, he was a close friend and political ally of both Abraham Lincoln and Ulysses S. Grant, and I'll get into that in more detail. But certainly with Lincoln for the 5 years between 1860 and 65, when Lincoln was assassinated, even more so with Ulysses Grant. George first met Grant in 1864 when Grant came to the White House to get his promotion to Lieutenant General from Abraham Lincoln. And in 1885, George was one of the pallbearers at Ulysses Grant's funeral in New York City that was witnessed by 1.5 million people on the streets of New York. So developed a strong friendship with Ulysses Grant over a 21-year period. We'll also get into other presidents he knew but didn't admire quite so much, such as Andrew Johnson. George helped lead the impeachment campaign against Johnson in 1867, 1868. And then at the end of his life, even though George admired much about Teddy Roosevelt, and especially Roosevelt's domestic progressivism on labor issues and big capital and issues like that, George opposed Teddy Roosevelt and the American annexation of the Philippines that Roosevelt was trying to engineer and did engineer following the Spanish-American War. So a long, long span in American public life. But more consequential than that was the breadth and depth of George's expertise. Too many things to go into on this slide, but I really can make the case that not many American public figures have been as well versed in a broad range of public policy issues like George Boutwell, from domestic policy, civil rights, and constitutional law, gained through the Mass House and as governor, Congress, and the cabinet, working for civil rights in the South, both during the war in terms of emancipation and then following the war in terms of Reconstruction. Economic policy and finance. George cut his teeth on those issues first in the Massachusetts House, where he served 7 terms in the 1840s, then as the youngest ever governor of Massachusetts, 1851 to 53, but most importantly as Revenue Commissioner for Lincoln and Treasury Secretary for U.S. Grant. Then finally, foreign affairs. At the end of his life, in the last 20 years, George became an expert in international law. He served on various commissions appointed by presidents like Chester Arthur and others. He was appointed, he was hired by the Kingdom of Hawaii in the middle of the 1800s to protect their interests, their sugar interests, which were being challenged by Louisiana sugar planters in the middle of the 1800s. Hawaii sugar was being let in duty-free. Louisiana planters wanted duties and tariffs imposed on Hawaiian sugar. The important point there was that George was always a firm believer in independence for the Kingdom of Hawaii. He did not favor American annexation of Hawaii either in the 1880s or when it finally happened in the 1890s. And then finally, we'll get into his presidency of the Anti-Imperialist League, challenging American annexation of the Philippines following the Spanish-American War. So, very long career, 65 years, and an incredibly diverse set of public policy issues that George was involved in. So, where did he come from? George was born in 1818 on a farm in Brookline, Mass., back when Brookline was just countryside in the vicinity of Boston. His father was a manager for a farm owned by a wealthy landowner, and actually Mavis and I were at the Adams National Site today. The landowner was not Peter Chardon Brooks, but Peter Brooks helped George's father get that job. So there was kind of a, 3 degrees of separation or whatnot between George and Peter Chardon Brooks and the Adams family. Well, George's father worked that job for 2 years, finally saved enough money to buy his own farm in Lunenburg, Mass., central Mass., where, of course, real estate prices were a hell of a lot cheaper than they were in the Boston area, no different today. Had a nice 120-acre farm in Lunenburg, and this was George's education growing up on the family farm, learning husbandry, learning the agricultural trade, learning how to graft fruit trees at the age of 10, going to a common school in the winter, but working on the farm in the summer. George ended up never graduating from high school, never went to college, never went to law school. In that respect, very much like Lincoln. He was self-educated, working in a dry goods store. His first major break in 1835, moving to Groton, Mass. Anyone ever been to Groton? There's the Governor Boutwell house in Groton. It's still there, the house he lived in. It was transferred to the Groton Historical Society in 1933, and it's a wonderful period piece where you can go and visit the house that George and his family lived in his case, well, from 1851 when it was built until 1905 when he died. So George moves to Groton. He starts studying law with local lawyers, begins to get involved in local politics, has his first visit to Washington in 1839, and this is where he has his first visceral experience of slavery. Growing up in Groton, obviously in the 1830s, didn't have direct contact with slavery. But when he's in Washington on that trip, he's walking around on a Sunday morning on the National Mall, and that's where an infamous slave pen was located, where slaves were bought and sold and then kept until they were transferred down to Mississippi and Louisiana and places further south. George meets an elderly woman who is totally distraught because her daughter is being kept in the slave pen. She knows, the mother knows, she's never going to see the daughter again because she's going to be transferred to Louisiana the next morning. And he said it just made an impression upon him that stayed with him for the rest of his life. Now, it is true that being in Groton had a very strong anti-slavery society. Frederick Douglass came to speak in Groton 3 times in the early 1840s. And so George would have heard Douglass coming through town speaking about the evils of slavery. When he gets elected to the Mass House for the first time in 1841, serves 7 terms, he gets married to Sarah Thayer from Hollis, New Hampshire, has 2 children, Georgiana, an elder daughter, and Francis, a younger son. And it's in the 1840s that the influence of John Quincy Adams becomes apparent. Now, George had probably heard Adams in the 1830s on this trip to Washington when Adams was a congressman in the House of Representatives, railing against the evils of the slave power, talking about the right of petition. The individual citizen should have the right to petition their government for the redress of grievances. And of course, that's when the slave power was trying to impose the gag rule on John Quincy Adams to rule those petitions out of order. George does the same thing in the Massachusetts House in the 1840s, champions the right of petition, champions anti-slavery issues in the Massachusetts House. He then is elected the youngest ever governor of Massachusetts in 1851 in a coalition with the Free Soil Party that overthrows the dominant Whig Party, and he's beginning his ascendance into national politics. I've already pretty much talked about John, Quincy Adams and George, the gag rule and the right of petition. 1848, as a member of the Massachusetts House of Representatives, George is part of the official delegation that greets Adams's body when it's sent from Boston to Washington to Boston for ultimate burial in Quincy. George is part of the delegation that meets the Adams funeral cortege, accompanies the body down to Quincy, and then is part of the funeral procession here in Quincy when John Quincy Adams is laid to rest. Well, youngest ever governor of Massachusetts in the early 1850s, he then helps found the Republican Party in Massachusetts in 1854-55. And really one of his big breaks on the national scene comes in 1860 at the Republican National Convention. The picture is of the Wigwam, the kind of hastily constructed convention hall in Chicago, where Abraham Lincoln is nominated as the Republican presidential candidate. George not only attended that convention, he's chosen as one of 7 members of the platform drafting committee. A real honor given that there are 450 delegates attending the convention. And the most important plank of that platform is that the Republicans were saying there should be no extension of slavery into the Western territories or into any newly acquired territories that the United States should make. For the slave power, for the Southern slave owners, this was anathema. Said if we're not allowed to expand into new territories, slavery will die. Well, that's precisely what George and Lincoln wanted to have happen. If they could circumscribe slavery within the Deep South, where it was constitutionally protected by the 1787 Constitution, but if they could prescribe it in the South, they knew that it would ultimately become extinct and expire. So he's at that convention. He meets Lincoln in Springfield, Illinois, following the convention, and that's the beginning of their relationship. 2 years later, Lincoln appoints George as the country's first ever Commissioner of Revenue. An important tax act to raise needed funds for the Union Army that year has established the country's first ever income tax and other taxes to support the Union Army during the Civil War with the Confederates. So when I tell people I'm related to the person who introduced the very first income tax in the United States, please don't hold it against me. It was a wartime measure that was very needed and crucial for the Union to win the conflict against the Southern Confederacy. These are some of the important dates in the Lincoln-Boutwell relationship. The first one is kind of neat because it's a Jefferson birthday dinner that was held at the Parker House Hotel here in Boston. As the ex-governor, George is the chair of that Republican Party meeting. Lincoln didn't come to it, neither did Henry William Seward or Salmon Chase or the other Republican kind of jockeying for the nomination, but they all sent letters to that dinner, which George read, and it's a very important letter on the part of Lincoln in which he invokes the Declaration of Independence as an important signpost for doing away with slavery. So George's first kind of long-distance relationship with Lincoln is 1859. As I mentioned, he meets him in May of 1860. And the other is he attends an important peace conference in Washington, sees Lincoln again. When war breaks out in the spring of 1861, George is an important military liaison between Governor John Andrew of Massachusetts and the national government. And remember that Massachusetts was the first state to respond to Lincoln's call for troops and military supplies. And George did that for the next 12 months. Is appointed Commissioner of Revenue by Lincoln in 1862, then is elected to the House of Representatives in 1863, where he is promoting Lincoln's policy of emancipation and the freeing of the slaves. In 1865, when Lincoln is assassinated on April 14th, 15th, George is not in Washington. He's come home to be with his family in Groton, Massachusetts. but he gives an important eulogy in Lowell, Mass., traveling from Groton to Lowell, to talk about Lincoln and all he had done to keep the country together through 4 years of hellish civil war. Well, going into the House in 1863, this is kind of the 14 years of George's service in Washington, D.C. He's been Revenue Commissioner, but he's now elected to the House. He serves in the House of Representatives for 6 years until 1869, where he helps write both the 14th and 15th Amendments to the Constitution, leads the impeachment of Andrew Johnson, and is essentially one of the leading radical Republicans trying to protect black civil rights in the South, which is what that cartoon is all about. Andrew Johnson is on the far left. He's scowling because a black man is casting his vote. The man standing next to Johnson with the top hat, or the guy standing to his right, is a Southern, Confederate who shares Johnson's disdain for any concept of blacks being able to vote. And the person standing behind the black man voting represents the federal government, that it would take the protection of the federal government and the support of the federal government to ensure that blacks were allowed to vote in the South after the Civil War, when Southern white governments were doing everything they could to take that vote away. Well, George serves for 6 years. He's then appointed by Ulysses Grant to be Treasury Secretary from 1869 to 1873. That's important for Reconstruction and civil rights, because at the time the Secret Service came under the direction of the Treasury Department, so George had overall direction of the Secret Service. And in addition to one of their main tasks was to prevent counterfeiting of bills and whatnot coming from the Treasury Department, they also had a special role in infiltrating the KKK and white supremacist groups in the South, Alabama, Mississippi, Georgia, Louisiana, infiltrating those groups and bringing their leaders to prosecution for intimidation, fraud, violence, and murder being committed on a wide scale against Southern blacks and their white allies. So even as Treasury Secretary, George is involved in political protection of civil rights. Then he goes into the U.S. Senate for 4 years, 1873 to 77, from Massachusetts senator, helps pass the 1875 Civil Rights Act. And the final item, the 1876 Mississippi Report. When I was doing the research and came across this document, this really was incredibly a special emotional bond, in the sense that it's the end of Reconstruction in 1876. The American people are getting tired of defending black rights in the South. They're getting tired of having the federal government send the military into the South to protect black rights. The South is saying, if you'll just leave us alone, we can take care of our social relations with our black neighbors, and the North is finally getting tired of it. 1876 is the American centennial. The country is 100 years old. People just want to move on. They want to put the Civil War behind them. They want to get on with rebuilding the country. Well, George's report is a 2,000-page document detailing Southern outrages committed against blacks during the 1875 Mississippi election. You can just Google it on the web, and it's right there to read, all 2,000 pages if you want to. Most of it is firsthand testimony, eyewitness testimony that's taken by George's Senate committee about what outrages, murder, intimidation, and violence was perpetrated against blacks in the South. So even at the end of Reconstruction, when everybody else is tiring of trying to protect black rights and equality for all, George Boutwell is still there on the floor of the Senate saying, nope, the job isn't done, and we need to ensure protection of equal rights. Another real revelation, I had no idea the strong personal relationship that George had with Ulysses Grant, who I came to admire greatly. This drawing, this is George as Treasury Secretary. He's on our right, Grant's at the far end. George is the one with black beard. Hamilton Fish, the Secretary of State, is to the left. George was, Grant's right-hand man and one of his most important cabinet appointees for the 4 years that he served as Treasury Secretary from 1869 to 1873. A couple of Notable events during that tenure: there was a gold ring scandal on Wall Street. Two guys tried to corner the gold market, but ultimately were foiled by Grant and Boutwell, who sniffed a rat and released enough government gold into the market to bring the price down and break the gold conspiracy when they were trying to corner the market. 1871, George was instrumental in going up to Capitol Hill with Grant to urge Congress to pass what was known as the KKK Act, which gave the president increased powers to go after the Ku Klux Klan and other white supremacist groups in the South in 1871. Their relationship continued even after Grant left office in 1877. Some people say that Grant made kind of an ill-considered attempt at a third term in 1880. There was no prohibition against it like there is now, but he came back from a worldwide trip thinking, well, maybe I can get one more term. George was one of his campaign managers at the National Convention for the 1880 nomination. And as I said, they continued their relationship so that when Grant died in July of 1885, Grant's family asked George to be one of the pallbearers, escorting the body through 7 miles of Manhattan streets from Lower Manhattan up to Riverside Park, where Grant is now buried in Grant's tomb, and escorted Grant's coffin to his final resting place. The relationship between George and Grant even extended to their families. George's older daughter, Georgiana, had a very strong relationship with Ulysses Grant, and that relationship with the family continued even after Grant's death in 1885. So one thing as a family member that I've been very proud of is that a deep, deep friendship among two men who were both kind of modest when it came to touting their accomplishments. They kept their nose on the job. They were not promoters or self-seekers or larger-than-life characters, but they believed in public service. They believed that their calling was, in Grant's case, both military and civilian. In George's case, in terms of the many roles he played over 60 years. So just a wonderful relationship with wonderful correspondence between the two of them that I found at the Grant Library in Mississippi, Library of Congress, and other places like that. Finally, we get to international affairs. I mentioned this at the very beginning. In 1877, George is defeated in his run for re-election to Congress, in part because the North and people even in Massachusetts are tired of Reconstruction. And they identify George with Reconstruction, protection of black civil rights, and he's defeated in his bid for the Senate in 1877. Begins focusing on international affairs, international commissions. The Spanish-American War happens in 1898. Only lasted 4 or 5 months. Admiral Dewey sinks the Spanish fleet in the Bay of Manila in August of 1898. But what happens after that is that first McKinley, who's pictured here, and then Teddy Roosevelt, after McKinley is assassinated, want to annex the 10 million people living on the island of the Philippines, in addition to controlling Cuba, Puerto Rico, and other possessions that fell into our lap following the Spanish-American War. Well, for George, it was cut and dry. America was going to do to the Filipinos what they were going to do to the Filipinos was deny them the right of self-determination, independence, their civil rights, no different from what white Americans had done to blacks in the South, both before, during, and after the Civil War. So at the age of 80, if you can imagine, George is 80 years old, he's still vigorous, he's pure Yankee. He's in good shape, he's a farmer, he just has kept his nose to the grindstone. At the age of 80, he's asked to become president of this anti-imperialist league. He ends up working with people like Mark Twain, Andrew Carnegie, Jane Addams of Hull House, W.E.B. Du Bois, and Booker T. Washington from the black community, the social philosopher William James. All of them were involved in this anti-imperialist campaign to try and prevent the American or the U.S. government from what was really the first big imperialist venture on the part of America in its history following the Spanish-American War. And he takes that role on at the age of 80 years old. He's still doing it 7 years later when he dies of natural causes in his bed in his home in Groton, Massachusetts. He just kept at it, kept at it, kept at it. The cartoon on the left, the guys on the left-hand side of the cartoon, those are the members of the Anti-Imperialist League. George is the one with the big white beard, which had grown white at that point behind. The guys on the right are the Filipino, freedom fighters who were battling the U.S. troops in the Philippines for self-determination and independence. But McKinley represents, the power, burgeoning power of America, striding onto the world stage at the beginning of the 20th century and flexing its muscles overseas. So that was George's kind of final third act, which he carried out from the age of 80 to 87 in international affairs. Well, that's my pitch as to why I think George Boutwell is a pretty significant figure. When I first was trying to find an agent who might represent the book for publication, I went through 20 who said no. Finally, a woman out on the West Coast, thank God, said, there's a good story here. George's story deserves to be told. But having said that, you have to realize, speaking to me, that you are an unknown author writing about an unknown subject, and it is not going to be easy to sell this to a major publisher. So what I want you to do is, one, explain why George was so important, but then you have to say, why isn't he better known? If he was such a big shot, if he was so important, why have Americans, essentially never heard of him? So that was a really good exercise, and it made me think down, set down on paper why I thought so. And I come up with two main reasons. One is personality. George was just not an attention seeker. If you think back to Reconstruction figures, people like Thaddeus Stevens or Charles Sumner from Massachusetts, these were larger-than-life characters, great orators on the floor of the Senate, and who loved to toot their own horns. George was not like that at all. Even more so, George was disdained by the Boston, Harvard intellectual elites, people like Henry Adams from here in Quincy. The Education of Henry Adams, you can go to that book. He is scathing about George Boutwell. Who is this guy, George Boutwell? He's a farmer's son. He has no business being at the upper echelons of the U.S. government. Henry Adams said the same thing about Ulysses Grant, terrible president, and they have no business running the government. Well, Henry Adams, was not, enough said. He had his own axe to grind, and he took it out on Grant and Boutwell. But even the Harvard elites, James Russell Lowell, The Nation magazine, and others just, saw George as this farmer's son who, didn't deserve much attention. That's one reason, but by far the less important reason. The more important reason is that George, for really almost 100 years, was seen as being on the losing side of history. The Johnson impeachment for many years was criticized. The Grant administration, because of people like Henry Adams, was highly criticized. Grant, in terms of professional historians, was ranked close to the bottom of the list for many, many years. In the last 30 years, that's been changing mightily. He's much more highly regarded for his presidency than he was before. But George suffered because of his association with the Ulysses Grant. The anti-imperialist campaign was vilified, was criticized for many years as being these kind of old fogies who were trying to deny America's right on the international stage, America striding into the 20th century. Well, in terms of nation building and sending American military power overseas, more recent experiences of Vietnam and Iraq and Afghanistan, the Philippines annexation has been seen in a somewhat different light. Most important is Reconstruction and the triumph of lost cause historiography. The fact that the Southern Confederates did a great job for 80 to 100 years after the Civil War of pushing the narrative that they had been wrongly treated, that the Civil War had not been about slavery, it was all about states' rights. If the North had only left the South alone, especially during Reconstruction, everything would have been just fine, and the South really kind of was able to paint people like George Boutwell and Grant and Thaddeus Stevens and Charles Sumner as these maniacal Northerners who were coming down to impose their way of life on the South. Well, that whole historiography, again, has changed greatly in the last 40 or 50 years. People now know that the monuments, Confederate monuments, or D.W. Griffith's movie Birth of a Nation, which helped push that narrative as well, were all just kind of a social, intellectual, historical narrative that the South was able to push on the country for 80 to 100 years. I have a picture of this guy because he's one of the first people who helped deflate that narrative or put a pin in the balloon of that narrative. That's Benjamin Quarles. He is a prominent African-American historian who taught at Morgan State University near Baltimore for many years. In 1933, Benjamin Quarles was a young graduate student at the University of Wisconsin. He wants to write a biography or wants to write his thesis about a prominent black figure in American history. Well, at the time, the white narrative is dominant in American historiography. One of his teachers says, no, we won't let you write about blacks. There's not enough primary material. We're not even sure that blacks writing about other blacks can be objective. How condescending can you get? He was told in no uncertain terms you will not be able to write, your history thesis about a black figure. He wanted to do it about Frederick Douglass. So he looks around, he finds a white politician from Reconstruction that he thinks best represents the concept of black agency. The fact that blacks were just not passive recipients of freedom or equal rights, that they had been working actively for this for many years, even before the Civil War, in terms of escaping Harriet Tubman and the Underground Railroad, but then especially during the Civil War and after, the blacks were active participants in fighting for their own rights. So Benjamin Quarles writes his master's thesis about George Boutwell. And he says, this is the guy, the white politician who most nearly represented the concept of black agency. If I can't write about a black, well, I'll find a white who was pushing for black rights. And he writes a 133 master's thesis about George Boutwell. When I discovered that on the web, I almost fell over. I sent my $60 off to the University of Wisconsin. They sent me a copy of the thesis, and it's just an absolute wonderful, wonderful revelation on the part of a young historian writing in 1933 when nobody else was saying this. Eminent American historians, Henry Steele Commager, Alan Nevins, and others are pushing the narrative that the North had been unfair to the South during Reconstruction, but this guy helps to, unravel that narrative in 1933. He does end up writing his PhD thesis about Frederick Douglass because his next thesis advisor says, yes, you can. But Benjamin Quarles deserves a lot of credit for being one of the first people to discover that George Boutwell was absolutely worth writing about. Well, I've mentioned how that whole narrative has been changing, and it really is it's a sea change in how American historians have seen the Civil War and the Reconstruction. Two of the best books on the Andrew Johnson impeachment in the past 10 years by David Stewart and Brenda Wineapple. The Grant presidency has been reinterpreted and retold by Ron Chernow and Ronald White and Charles Calhoun. New books about anti-imperialism, given much more credit to the Anti-Imperialist League that George headed in 1898 in terms of the annexation of the Philippines. And again, most importantly, Reconstruction has been totally, seen in a new light, both its pluses and negatives. There hasn't been a total black and white change. There were excesses. There were carpetbaggers who went south and took advantage of the Southern whites who'd been defeated, but it was not to the extent that the Southern whites would have you believe. And Eric Foner, Nicholas Lehman, and of course Benjamin Quarles, and I can name 10 or 15 or 20 other histories that have also given us new insights into Reconstruction. So because of that, it was kind of a nice confluence. I haven't really given you my personal story in all of this. It was mentioned that I am a relative of George's. We have a common ancestor. I grew up in Boston, lived in Winchester for a while and then Concord. My family never mentioned George Boutwell. I never knew we had this illustrious relative from the 1800s, youngest ever governor of Massachusetts, at the House, the Senate, Treasury Department, Revenue Commissioner, all of the things that George did. It was only in my 20s and 30s, because of my love of history, and I see his name here, and I see his name there, and gradually it's becoming apparent, there's this guy with my last name who did some pretty important stuff. But it really was only in the last 20 or 30 years when I start reading these histories, and George is getting a lot more attention from these guys as to the positive role he played during the Johnson impeachment, during Reconstruction, during the Grant presidency, during the anti-imperialist campaign, that 4 or 5 years ago at the beginning of the pandemic, Mavis and I did a lot of work on US-Cuba relations together, and that's what I was doing prior to kind of 2016-17 when we had a change in the presidency, which meant that we couldn't work on US-Cuba relations anymore, so I had to find something else to do. And I start digging into George's story, and in 2019, 2020, start doing serious research and know that there's a story there that really does deserve to be told. So the book came out last January. I've probably given 35 to 40 talks since then. Recent ones at the Mississippi Book Festival in Jackson, Mississippi, last week in the U.S. Treasury Building in Washington, D.C., where George was Treasury Secretary. And it's just been a real thrill, as you can imagine, for a family member to be able to, go around and say that this guy was pretty important and people should, he deserves to be better known. So, thank you very much. Questions? Oh, everybody's been thrilled. I mean, to know that there was this guy who really deserved to be better known. One of the cool things about this, I discovered, I never was much for Facebook until I got into this, but I'm now on Facebook, and I discovered there's an Everything Boutwell Facebook page. Boutwell family members, 650 of them from across the country, are part of this Facebook page. So I've been connecting with Boutwell family members in Minnesota, Mississippi, California, all over the country. And when I go to places like Tennessee or Mississippi, I'll give a book talk, and some guy will come up and say, "Hi, my name's David Boutwell. We're related somehow, and I'm thrilled to know that you've written this book about, a family member." So I'm meeting them wherever I go around the country. The reason I'm not a direct descendant is that George had no direct descendants. His daughter and son, daughter was single her whole life. The son did marry late in life but didn't have children. So George's line stopped with his son and daughter, and he has no direct descendants. But his family plot is in Groton, and there are pictures of it on my website. On this, whenever I'm in Massachusetts, I have to tell a story about the connection between George and John F. Kennedy. I mentioned the Mississippi Report of 1876. George is detailing outrages that have been perpetrated on blacks in Mississippi during the elections. Well, in 1956, as I'm sure everybody knows, John Kennedy publishes Profiles in Courage. Wins a Pulitzer Prize. It's a profiles of 8 different senators that John Kennedy thinks exhibited unusual political courage. I would disagree with 2 of his choices, and the one most I would disagree is a guy named Lucius Lamar, who was a senator from Mississippi in the 1870s and 80s. John Kennedy in 1956 totally buys into the whole lost cause historiography. He admires Lamar. He says Lamar is to be congratulated for giving an important eulogy for Charles Sumner, but for trying to promote North-South reconciliation during Reconstruction after the Civil War. Well, what Kennedy doesn't mention is that, yes, Lamar was doing that in Washington. When he was back in Mississippi, he was directing the white Democratic Party to commit voter fraud and violence against blacks so the Democrats could come back into power. There are a couple of quotes in Kennedy's book, in that chapter about Lucius Lamar, that Reconstruction was a black nightmare the South could never forget. Well, black nightmare for who? The blacks or the whites? John Kennedy means the whites, when it was really a nightmare for the blacks. And he also says the North imposed Reconstruction at the point of the bayonet, and he's criticizing Ulysses Grant for sending military troops to the South to protect black rights. That's 1956, and I'll give you some reasons if you want as to why John Kennedy was writing about that in 1956. 6 years later, as president in 1962, James Meredith tries to get admission to the University of Mississippi, and Ross Barnett, the governor of Mississippi, blocks the entryway, will not let him in. Who sends federal marshals and federal troops to Oxford, Mississippi to make sure James Meredith can get into the university? President John F. Kennedy. He does exactly the same thing in 1862 that 6 years before he had heavily criticized Ulysses Grant for doing 100 years before. So it was nice to see that kind of change from being a senator to what he did as president to protect black rights. Mentioning Abigail Adams, George was not without his blind spots, never supported women's suffrage until he was very, very late in his life, until his declining years. Even in the 1870s and 60s, when he might have been able to do something about it, he had this very archaic concept of American society in saying that the family is the unit of society. The man is the head of the family. He's the one who should vote. He's the one who should pay taxes. And I had a great rejoinder to that in one of the memoirs or somewhere. Somebody once asked George, well, okay, you say the man is the head of the family and he's the only one who should be able to pay taxes or vote. What if the man dies and the woman becomes the head of the family? Well, she's not the head of the family. Your whole argument is the head of the family is the one who should vote. Why not women? Well, he did not have a good answer for that. That's just the nature of things. So he did have his blind spots, even though he had a daughter, Georgiana, who I'm sure constantly pushed him because she was a real, impressive individual in her own right. So, I mean, there's several Boutwell things in Groton. There were some Boutwell things in Lunenburg, where the family farm was, and a few others. Might end with just, this is totally kind of off the wall, but I mentioned he was born in Brookline, 1818. Back then it was farm country. Over time, that farm country became the prestigious golf course of the Country Club in Brookline, one of the most famous golf courses in the country, site of U.S. Opens and Ryder Cups. The foundation of the farmhouse where George was born is today the foundation of the modern clubhouse of the Country Club of Brookline. And I got a chance to go there once and go down underneath the modern clubhouse, and there's the foundation of the farmhouse that George would have been born in 1818, more than 200 years ago. So I'm sure little knowing when he was born in 1818 that it would become such expensive real estate more than 200 years later. Oh, thank you.